Hello everyone. In this chapter of Life on Planet Earth, we are going to focus on the human impact on our environment, on our biosphere. So the picture I'm showing you here is a picture of a panda. Panda are native to China. This species almost went extinct. Why? Because of loss of habitat, because of human activity. There is a global effort to preserve this species so that this species has become actually the mascot of worldwide effort to maintain, to preserve wildlife across the globe. As we cover this chapter, and as we think about these pandas, we want to basically have in mind a couple of questions. One, it's what type of ecological consequences would result as consequence of the extinction of pandas? What would happen to the bamboo that actually the pandas are very much focused on spreading the seed of, right? Which is more important in the culture of conservation of a wildlife such as panda? Is it the direct value? Is it the indirect value? I'm talking about economical values. I'm talking about the direct values on our environment. What is the role that the panda play in its ecosystem, right? We saw in the previous chapter that living organisms interact with each other in many ways, sometimes in mutually beneficial ways, sometimes not so much mutually beneficial ways. In any ways, there are interactions, right? Interspecific relationships that develop, right? If a panda was to disappear as a species, what would be the consequence? So these are the kind of aspects we want to think about when we dive in this chapter. So now we are going to take a look at conservation biology, biodiversity, resources and environmental impact, and sustainability in the societies where we live. The first step we are going to make, it's going to be on conservation biology. Conservation biology, it's actually at intersection between basic biology and applied biology. In basic biology, we are addressing aspects such as genetics, physiology, behavior, systematics, ecology, field biology, and evolutionary biology. So as we look at different species in the study of biology, we are going to ask this very basic, we're going to dive into this very basic aspects of biology. Eventually, from what we are going to learn, we're going to find some applications. Why do we try to understand how organisms respond to their environment? Well, because eventually the environment changes. It changes over time, whether it is naturally or it is by way of human activity. The environment changes, right? We want to preserve some of the organism, if not all, right? But how do we go about that? So now we have to apply the knowledge we acquire from basic biology. We have some applications such as veterinary science, forestry to manage the forest, biopark management. We create whole systems where we say, well, in this area, you are not allowed to hunt or to fish because we want to preserve that environment. First of all, we understand the dynamics in that environment. We understand the values of preserving that environment. Therefore, we are going to apply what we learn from studying the organisms, the ecosystems, so that this environment can exist not only for today, but also for the future, right? Other disciplines are, for instance, fishery biology, range management, agronomy, wildlife management. In any case, we see that conservation biology, it's interdisciplinary, right? So that we can preserve our environment, not just for us, but also for future generations. So we want sustainability. Conservation biology is very unique because it supports many ethical concepts. This many ethical concepts are going to stem from the perspective that, and the premise is that, biodiversity is good for Earth, but it's also good for us, right? It's not just, we are not just saying it's good for Earth, but it's also good for us, right? Extinction, it's not something that we want to see happening. Some people can argue that, well, what is the role of mosquitoes? Because mosquitoes can cause malaria, they can cause dengue fever, they can cause, infection to the Zika virus. What is the good of mosquitoes? Well, believe it or not because mosquitoes cause these problems to humans, that mosquitoes do not play overall a good in the ecosystem, in the global ecosystem, right? Not because something doesn't have a direct value to us, that it doesn't have a direct value to the environment. We have to consider that. And conservation biology embraces the premise that we don't want to see any species going extinct, right? Another premise is that the interaction within ecosystem supports biodiversity and are beneficial to human. Finally, biodiversity is the result of evolutionary change and has great values to human. So these are some ethical principles that drive biology conservation, right? Or conservation biology, if you will. So as we think about that, let's take a look at some of the facts that we found based on the studies, and also the different direct and indirect values that biodiversity has for us and for the environment. So it is believed that in the next 20 to 50 years, approximately 10 to 20% of biodiversity on Earth will be lost to extinction. Why do we think that? We think that because of the pattern of what we've been observing, we cause deforestation at a relatively high pace, actually faster than the forest can regenerate. And even if the forest can regenerate, well, we are building housing, we are building malls, we have factories that, regardless of how we turn things, regardless of how many trees we plant, we cannot literally replace all that we have destroyed. That is a fact, right? So there is a real threat that many species may be driven to extinction in the next 20 to 50 years. Conservation biology is going to put a particular emphasis on the importance and value of biodiversity, right? Right? We're going to recognize that human actions are contributing to causing extinction, and we are going to show later on today that actually human actions account a lot for much of the loss in biodiversity. So before we actually dive into this, I want to ask some questions to you. What is your personal responsibility in the effort to preserve biodiversity? Think about that question. And again, I'm directing that question to you. As I'm directing that question to you, I'm also directing that question to myself. What is my personal contribution in trying to preserve biodiversity? 2, it's considering the first question: what are you going to commit to doing to participate in conservation of biodiversity? What are you going to do? Okay, so these are some questions that I'm directing to you. And these questions, the same, I'm directing to myself. Am I doing something to actually create a sustainable community? What am I doing to do that, right? So think about these questions, and this is my challenge to you. Now, let's take a look at biodiversity, loss of biodiversity, and some reasons that cause loss of biodiversity. So biodiversity, it's basically about the number of species, the different species living on Earth. How many are there, right? Now, there is another question in biodiversity. It's basically about the relative abundance. Yes, we do have maybe a variation of species, but in relative abundance, are they relatively abundant, each of the species? Or is it that you only have one representative of one species as opposition to 100,000 of another species, right? So keep that in mind. So this graph, histogram, actually shows you the impact of some aspects on biodiversity. So when we look at habitat loss, by far, habitat loss is the number one reason that explains the loss of biodiversity. This is followed by exotic species or introduced species, right? So when you look at the percentage of species that are affected by exotic species and loss of habitat, you see that loss of habitat is by far the largest one that have an impact, followed by pollution and over-exploitation of resources, and very minimally, notice very minimally, diseases. Diseases occur in the environment, right? So deers get sick, bears get sick, birds get sick, right? But by far, the activities that we have on our environment, including loss of habitat and introduced species, by far are the one that threaten biodiversity, which means that we have to think as to our role in this aspect. So needless to say that today we are in biodiversity crisis, right? Biodiversity actually has a great value to not just human, but also to the environment. These values are direct, some of them are indirect. What are some of the direct values and indirect value to humans? That's what we are going to address now. Now, before we address the direct and indirect values, let's mention that life is not equally distributed across the globe. There are some areas where life is abundant, some areas where life is not very abundant because of temperatures, because of water availability, right? However, when it comes to biodiversity, there are some areas of the globe where we record a huge biodiversity. This biodiversity, these pockets of biodiversity in the globe are called hotspots. These hotspots are going to be the subject of many studies, right? Now, it is also a fact that we are going to designate a place as a hotspot based on the studies that have been done in that area, in that geographical area. Because if we have not been in a particular geographical area because of difficulty to accessing that area, or just simply, we don't show any interest in going in that area, that doesn't mean that there is no biodiversity hotspots in that area. You have to keep that into account. So in red and pink, this is where we have the hotspots of biodiversity on Earth. So that being said, we see that the unequal distribution of biodiversity is representing actually about 2.4% of the Earth. So we have a huge amount of land where actually we don't have this biodiversity hotspots, okay, across the globe. But this 2.4% of the Earth contains over 50% of the world plants and 42% of the terrestrial vertebrate in terms of biodiversity. Now, again, it's based on the study that have been done. If we have not done a particular study in a particular region, that doesn't mean that there is no hotspot in these regions where we have not done some studies. All right, now let's take a look at the direct values to human. Biodiversity has a tremendous direct value to human. Some plants, for instance, are producing drugs, including the rosy periwinkle here, that produces many anti-cancer drugs. These anti-cancer drugs are good at treating cancers such as leukemia and such as Hodgkin's disease, which is a type of cancer, right? Now, because of the antimicrobials that are isolated for the periwinkle plant, in terms of leukemia, right, we have a survival rate that goes from 10% to 93%. Think about that. 93% of people who get cured from leukemia got cured because of the use of a drug that was isolated from this plant. How about production of painkillers? We have this snail cone that produce very powerful painkillers that are essential when we do, for instance, surgery, right? When we do, when we do some procedures that are painful, right? So these painkillers are very helpful to human in terms of health. Production of antibiotics. Fungi, such as Penicillium notatum, is responsible for the production of penicillin, right? We have bacteria that are responsible for the production of antibiotics, including streptomycin. That, by the way, is very effective at treating diseases such as tuberculosis, leprosy, to name only these two. And tetracycline, it's another antimicrobial or antibiotics that is produced by bacteria. So we have here a direct value in relation to medicine. More direct value, we have some organisms, including a ladybug here, can be used for pest control in a farming environment, right? When you are planting a crop, rather than using pesticides, using ladybugs can be very relevant in controlling the population of pests in an environment that is used for planting vegetables, for instance. Other form of agricultural value, we have bees that are pollinators of many types of plants, right? By preserving these bees, these plants are going to be pollinated. How about acquiring food from the sea, rivers, and lakes, right? We use resources that are in these bodies of water to basically sustain ourselves in terms of food. In the rubber industry, we have trees such as the rubber tree here, that once that tree is planted, it's going to produce rubber throughout their existence. So you plant the tree once and it produces you rubber over and over and over and over in as much as this tree is alive. This is a tremendous value to us. Indirect values are, for instance, the biogeochemical cycles. So biodiversity plays a very important role in the cycling of chemicals, in treating waste, and actually getting rid of pollution. There is, in microbiology, because I'm a microbiologist, one very important aspect of microbiology in terms of value of biodiversity, it's bioremediation. Bioremediation is the use of microorganisms to actually clean up the pollution that we are creating. Actually, in wastewater treatment facilities, we use a lot of microorganisms to actually clean the very water we release from our households, right? It goes in the city and the city treats that water. And after cleaning the water, they dump in rivers and streams the clean water, right? Or that water is recycled for use, for further use in the community, including watering crops and things like that. So waste disposal is very much an aspect that biodiversity is going to play a role in, right? The provision of fresh water. You have a lot of species in aquatic environment that actually filter the water from pollutants and make that water clean for the use of other organisms. The prevention of soil erosion by planting trees and grass and many other organisms that can retain the soil, we're not going to lose that soil to erosion, right? Biodiversity plays also a great role in the regulation of climate. When we plant trees, trees are going to absorb carbon dioxide. By absorbing carbon dioxide, we are eliminating from the atmosphere the excess carbon dioxide, which means that the environment is going to cool down. And notice that in places where you have a lot of forest, these places are relatively cool compared to places where you have a major deforestation. Ecotourism, it's another value that biodiversity brings to human, right? Just going out, enjoying the wild, seeing organisms not in zoos, but in their natural habitat, not in aquariums, but in their natural habitat is tremendous, is rewarding for those who work in a conservation field, but it's also rewarding for people who are coming out to just enjoy the environment. Now, as we consider the world population is increasing. As the world population increases, we need resources. And this need of resources is going to have necessarily an impact on our environment. What kind of resources we need to sustain ourselves? We need land to plant food, to live on. We need water to process materials, to produce the food, right? To drink. Obviously, we need food, different types of food, right? We need vegetables, we need fish, we need chicken, we need pork, and so on and so forth. We need energy. To produce food, we need energy. To produce water, we need energy. To produce anything, to have a good health, we need energy, right? Without that energy, we cannot run our fancy hospitals, right? That have fancy machines, right? That require energy. We need minerals. When we extract these minerals, we can, produce food. We can improve our health. We can improve so many things for ourselves and also for our environment. Now, whenever we extract these resources, we can only use so much. And what we use, well, we use. What we don't use, what happened of it, right? For instance, we extract or we produce fertilizers to have a nice lawn, right? So we sprinkle the fertilizers in our yard. Are we sprinkling just enough for what our yard needs, our grass needs, or are we sprinkling more than what our grass need? Well, let me tell you that 99.9% of the time, we are putting out there more fertilizers than our plants actually need. As a consequence of that, we are living up to the environment to manage the excess. But because the excess is excessive for what the environment can handle, now what is good is becoming bad. And that's what we call pollution, right? So as we consider resources, there are two kinds of resources. We have renewable resources and non-renewable resources. Among non-renewable resources, we're going to have fossil fuel, the amount of land, the minerals. At some point, we are going to run out of these things. Now, when you consider, for instance, the extractions of minerals in countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, you know, people are victim of overexploitation. People are being moved from where they were living naturally to other places where they cannot actually survive and thrive. And that causes disturbances, right, in the relationship among people. And the people who want all these minerals for the production of cell phones, iPads, fancy TVs, right? Well, someone is paying for that. Okay? And these someones are the very people who are displaced and who are victim of wars, because the wars are being fueled purposefully to get access to minerals, because native people say, well, I don't want to move out of my land, but governments and multinationals are saying, well, we need that mineral because this is what sustains the economy. And Apple, Samsung, Huawei, and many other high-tech companies, they say, we need the minerals. That's how we're going to produce the fancy cell phones. But, you know, we use that mineral, but these minerals are non-renewable. What is going to happen when they run out? What is going to happen when fossil fuel runs out? What is going to happen when we build everywhere, right? So remember that we have limited resources that eventually can run out, right? Then we have renewable resources. In terms of renewable resources, these are resources that are going to replenish regardless of how much of it we get. For instance, the sun, it's a resource that is there that human can never deplete, right? Solar energy, it's not going anywhere. Wind, it's not going anywhere, right? So we have this kind of resources that are renewable, that are very sustainable for us and our environment, for production of food, for production of, for improvement of health, and so on. Again, pollution occurs when we are actually putting more out than the environment can handle. That's what we call pollution. So alteration of environment in an undesirable way. The side effect of resource consumption is going to cause pollution, impact of human on the environment is proportionate to the size. The more numerous a population is, the more pollution we are going to see. Because people consume a lot, they also produce a lot of waste, right? When we consider the land use, most of the coast in the United States are occupied by humans, right? Whether you are talking about the East Coast, the South Coast, the West Coast, it's all occupied. And as all of this is occupied, we are necessarily having an impact on that coastal line, right? We are causing erosion, we are causing loss of diversity, loss of habitat, right? And so on and so forth. So it is estimated that 70% of beaches around North America, and specifically the United States, is eroding. Pollution is happening in this area big time. I don't know if you've been to California, in places like Los Angeles, you see a lot of pollution, right? You have in the East Coast, I used to live in Newark, New Jersey. You can see many places that are not very healthy to be around because of all the smog that is produced, right? So we have to do an effort in protecting these areas, that coastal line, for future generations. Desertification, because of logging, it's a major issue. Desertification, because of conversion of forest to food production areas, including planting crops, growing animals, it's going to cause the areas to go from areas that is populated with a diversity of organisms to an area that is semi-arid to completely arid, right? This is a major problem. We do see this in many parts of Africa, you know, in the United States, okay, in many places in the world, including in Australia, okay? So overgrazing of land, it's an issue if you consider places like Colorado, you know, to only mention that one. Deforestation in the tropical areas is a major issue, which is actually going to interfere with the ability of plants to participate in absorbing carbon dioxide, right? Absorbing heat. We're going to have temperatures that are going to increase when we do deforestation. We're going to lose soil, so we're going to have poor soils, erosions, right? Loss of habitat is going to cause loss of biodiversity. We're going to see an increase in carbon dioxide due to deforestation, okay? How about water? We use a lot of water for our crops. Actually, in the United States, about 39% of all the fresh water that we are using in the United States goes toward irrigation. Think about that. Not in drinking, but in irrigation, okay? In industrial processes, a bunch of water is going in there. Now, obviously, we drink water, but not anywhere near what we use for production of food and for industrialization, okay? Now, we also do some activities that are going to increase our access to water. For instance, building dams is going to increase our access to water. Pumping water from the aquifers, okay? But these activities, building dams, pumping water from the aquifers, do not go without consequences. These consequences include subsidence. What is subsidence? Subsidence is when there is an empty spot underneath of the earth. That empty spot that was at one time filled with liquid water, right, is now going to be empty, and the land is going to sink, right? Sinkholes are going to develop. Also, what we see as consequence of pumping water from the ground is the infiltration of salt water in the ground, so that when we mine for water, so in some places of the world, the water that comes out is not fresh. It's salt water. And that is a problem, because you cannot use that water for irrigation. You cannot use that water for drinking. You cannot use that water for showering, now what, right? The dams actually already mentioned the aspect about dams, but some of the things I need to mention, it's that dams are going to be used not only to access water, but also to use that water for our benefit, including production of electricity. Okay? The drawbacks: rivers are no longer flowing the way they used to flow when we build dams. Reservoirs lose water to evaporation. The salt is left behind, which can actually cause the land to not be suitable for use anymore because of high salt. The sedimentation built up and the negative impact on wildlife when some areas are flooded because of a major dam that was built. Wildlife is going to be lost in this area that are flooded. Okay? How about the areas that contained a lot of water, but now because of the construction of a dam, there is no more water in those areas, right? What happens to wildlife in this condition? That wildlife is going to be affected, right? So here we have a sinkhole that possibly is the consequence of sucking water from the aquifers. Now, to produce what we eat and drink, it takes water. And now, as example, it takes 6 gallons of water to grow this single dish of salad that you are going to eat just in one meal. In one single meal, you are eating salad that consumes the equivalent of 6 gallons. How about milk? For 1 glass of milk, you need 49 gallons of water. Now, 49 gallons of water to produce 1 glass of milk. Now, it's not so much the production of milk itself, more than it is the entire process that goes around producing that 1 glass of milk. You have to feed the cow, and it costs water to produce the food that the cow is going to eat. The cow has to drink, right? And after that, in the factory where the milk is produced so that it can land on your table, it also takes a bunch of water. Okay? How about production of a steak? Production of a steak, 1 serving, right, takes about 2,600 gallons of water. 2,600 gallons of water to produce 1 single serving of steak. If you were to eat 2 steaks, so 1 today and 1 tomorrow, your impact on water consumption, it's going to be 2,600 times 2. If you eat a steak like this 7 days a week, you have to multiply 2,600 times 7. That is going to give you an idea as to the impact that you are having on the environment when it comes to water consumption. That is the very reason why, by the way, we say that, well, we cannot eat exclusively one kind of food. We have to diversify our food. We have to be able to eat vegetables, right? We have to be able to eat seeds, and so on and so forth, so that, if today you ate 1 serving of steak, tomorrow you can eat a serving of salad and say, okay, well, that is going to be good for me, right? Impact 6 gallons. Okay? Think about that. Compared to 2,600, that's a huge difference. All right, we do, because of what we know today. Remember, conservation biology, it's an intersection between basic biology and applied biology, right? So we learned that some organisms are good at preserving water, right? We know that some techniques of growing food are good at preserving water. So what do? We apply that, right? So we know that cacti know how to preserve water. So to save water, rather than planting plants that are consuming a lot of water, we can favor this drought-resistant plants, the cacti here, so that we don't have to water them every day or even every week, right? Rather than just sprinkling the crop we are growing, we can apply what we call the drip technique. And that drip technique allows us to control how much water is going toward the production of the food that we eat.